Chapter 6 in your social media textbook, Dangerous Dreams. We're going to talk about some of the pathology out there that deals with this. It's really a fascinating chapter. So let's go ahead and get started. Maybe. There we go. In the wake of social media and its proliferating number of often inherently disordered applications that enable pathological narcissism and even criminal offenses, the debate is whether these technologies have actually created more offenders and new personality disorders or simply intensified existing ones. And I've come up with this question before. I've asked people this question before, and most people don't want to think about it. Um, is it the gaming? Is it the head shooting? Uh, is that what's teaching people how to kill people? Is it giving them the idea that people aren't real, that they're like zombies in some strange game, or some alien creatures that I can shoot with a gun? Is that what's happening? Is that why we're having more mass shootings? It's just one of those things that you need to think about. Are things changing? Is our world changing because of this communication that we have between ourselves? And are we losing contact with each other because we would rather have contact with people online than we would in real life? So people don't seem real to us. Social media normalizes autoerotic and narcissistic impulses that conventional social interactions offline might have helped to abate or otherwise mitigate through the heuristic processes such as observation, imitation, and modeling. What is most often cited is Albert Bandura's social learning theory. So his idea was that we watch other individuals and we start acting like those individuals. If we are doing the same thing online and we attach ourselves to a narcissistic website, are we going to start imitating those individuals, or a violent one, or a neo-Nazi one? The Oath Keepers, where in the world did they come from? Would they have still been here? Would we have still dealt with the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers and the Boogaloo Boys? Would we have to deal with those people if we didn't have social media? According to cognitive science, pieces of information are rearranged into brief sets that get stronger with each reinforcing piece of the puzzle. Finding other people who share the same tendencies and attitudes, however dysfunctional or abnormal, is a normative experience that isolates the group from those who disagree, criticize, or judge. And now, of course, we can live in silos. We can live in just this piece of information, this idea. We can live in those silos and not have to listen to the people telling you, wait a minute, that's a crazy idea. Where in the world did you get that? We don't have to listen to those people anymore. We can only listen to the people that we want to listen to. And because of that, of course, we may be having more extreme, dangerous dreams. In a sense, their reality becomes the only true reality, something to be accepted and coveted. And this can potentially be a problem if they are skewed, if they are pathological. There is a reason why some of the most prolific cyberbullies, trolls, and other deviants who gleefully engage in vexatious online behaviors are also sex offenders actively engaged in child luring, trafficking, and the exchange of pedophilic images. These are people that have been arrested for trafficking, for trafficking women and children. Some online predators are like a fetish burglar, targeting unconventional and typically personal or intimate items to steal as souvenirs and for further fantasy development. A voyeuristic burglar is aroused by looking at family photographs, looking through drawers, and even ransacking the home to undermine the sense of safety of the occupants. A somnophilic, also a somatophilic or hot prowler burglar, is aroused by the power of watching over people as they lie helplessly asleep and are oblivious to his or her presence. The active desecration burglar is a sadist who enjoys overtly defiling the personal sanctuary of a home, such as by urinating, defecating, or masturbating in a child's room. The passive desecration burglar, by contrast, relishes in leaving more subtle and disturbing signs of intrusion, such as moving or hiding the possessions of owners, lying down on their bed, or leaving half-eaten food in the fridge to be discovered. These are all fetish burglars. If you have ever seen the movie The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston, it starts out with someone coming into her bedroom and masturbating on the bed. The intrusion-focused burglar is like, and of course, that individual would be an active desecration burglar. The intrusion-focused burglar is likely the most difficult to detect, as he or she is primarily a voyeur who may not even enter the residence. It is the mere act of prying a door or breaking a window as simulated sex acts that gratify the offender, along with the sense of knowing that the owners will feel violated and frightened. Internet crimes and the related paraphilias that drive such behaviors are comparatively new. Because a great many of these crimes, if they are even classified as crimes by statute in the first place, involve teens and preteens, they also leave many stakeholders, mostly educators and parents, nervous about admitting, much less being prepared to address, an underlying sexual motivation. We're not trained to do anything with this. Why are we not trained? Because we haven't seen this before. No one has addressed this before. So now we have to do something about it. Now we have to either create laws, we have to create pathologies, we have to change the DSM-6 to include these problems so that we can deal with them. But until somebody deals with them, until somebody identifies them, we don't know what to do with it. Arado Mania, the phenomenon of a person developing an unfounded infatuation or imagined relationship with a person unknown or barely known to them. This is a historic offline manifestation. It commonly associated with a variety of stranger and acquaintance stalking behaviors. It often involves the sending of letters, gifts, and flowers, or making hang-up phone calls. Generally, it's considered more of a nuisance and an annoyance than a genuine threat to safety, and generally non-criminal in nature. In other words, if we came in contact with one of these people that were suffering from Arado Mania, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it, mainly because they haven't really done anything that's criminal. But they are, in essence, they're stalking people, or whoever it is that they have this Arado manic episode with. There was a librarian at Purdue University who developed a fixation for a Nobel Prize winning physicist that worked at Purdue. She had only seen him. When, after he died, of course, she claimed that she had had his baby. She claimed a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, they determined that she had really never had a conversation with him except to check out his books. And they found pictures of him at the library. They found cards from the library catalog that he had dealt with. It was just bizarre, all of these things that she had accumulated. And he didn't know her from anybody. You know, he just went to the library to read or to do whatever he did. He had no clue. He had no clue that this lady had a fixation on him. Erotomania, new online manifestations potentially, with the vast majority of cyber stalking incidents like offline stalking, thought to involve strangers or acquaintances. It is constantly non-sight and stranger obsessional in nature. It can include the compulsive viewing of social media profiles and images, and this is known as creeping. You guys know what creeping is. I had no idea about creeping. I had but it happened to me. I had a student that was in one of my classes. She had some kind of a odd fixation on me, and she would show up at various places where I was, and I didn't understand what was going on. You know, I just thought, oh, what a coincidence. here she is again. But one of the other students said, she's creeping on you. And I had no idea what was going on. And now I understand what was happening. Of course, this is 5 years after the fact, but she transferred out of the school. Uh, Whether it was because of me or whatever, I don't know. It was really kind of odd running into her. I'd go to the gym to lift weights, and she would be there. Um, I would go to a basketball game, and she was actually on the dance team. Anyway, it was really kind of weird. She kept taking my classes, but she wasn't a psychology major. Couldn't quite understand. I didn't think anything about it. I'm not real bright about these things, but somebody told me, one of her friends, she ran track. One of her friends said, she's creeping on you, man. And I didn't really. Now I understand what was going on. Creating fake social media accounts in order to gain a target's trust and initiate a dialogue, the online version of hang-up calls, excessively posting photos of oneself with the intent of its pushing to a target's feed, Gatsbying, this is known as Gatsbying, or repeating performance search engine queries of a target to find personal information or to view photographs, and this is known as active surveillance. In some cases, it may also include sending suggestive communications, often anonymously. Of course, that never happened with me, so don't get too excited about my creeper. It was more Arado Mania, I guess. Oh, it is Arado Mania. Um, Exhibitionism is the unsolicited practice of exposing one's body in explicit or suggestive fashion to captive audiences or non-consenting observers for attention, personal gratification, arousal, or excitement, or to project power. Historic offline manifestations, commonly associated with crimes such as committing an indecent act of causing a disturbance by indecent exhibition. The exhibitionist draws power by the shock, embarrassment, or fear of others, typically having a very specific visual fixation centered on the face of their target. Acts of exhibitionism can also be more subtle and non-criminal, such as undressing in front of open windows or dressing inappropriately for certain social contexts. In most cases, the exhibitionist relies on cues from others in terms of how to escalate their behavior. New online manifestations of exhibitionism. Sexting is a practice that consists of sending inappropriate images of oneself to others, often without prompting and without consent. As in its offline version, this can be done for attention, personal gratification, arousal, excitement, or to project power or to frighten. As with the offline variation of exhibitionism, now known to be strongly correlated with high-risk paraphilias such as sadism, it is the response and not the act itself that drives the offender. Scopophilia is often referred to as Voyeurism Scopophilia. It is another high-risk paraphilia centered on the sense of arousal, excitement, and power that a person obtains through a very specific visual stimulus. This usually involves secretly watching others without their consent, typically but not always in a private or intimate setting. Historic offline manifestations of scopophilia. Scapulophilia has only recently come to be understood as extremely dangerous behavior if left to escalate. From the use of concealed peepholes in change rooms or peering through windows to the installation of concealed cameras in change rooms, lockers, or under tables, this paraphilia has historically taken on a variety of dimensions, all with the view to allowing the voyeur to watch a specific person or situation at his leisure. New online manifestations. The conduct includes the use of electronic devices for the surreptitious and sexually motivated recording or photographing of unknown and non-consenting individuals. And this is actually a Korean Korean movie about scapophilia. That's what this says across here, scapulophilia. Scatologia. Scat means poop, okay? Logia means words or speech. So scatologia is talking dirty or talking about nasty stuff. This paraphilia involves an individual making obscene, threatening, or otherwise menacing open line, heavy breathing, etc. phone calls to either random or specific victims as means of self-gratification and to project power and dominance by causing fear and anxiety. A telephonic variation of exhibitionism where the offender is ultimately empowered and sexually excited by the fear and distress he or she causes. The new online manifestations, the virtual forms of communication, including communication between smartphones that more closely approximates the interface of a computer than a traditional landline telephone, cyberbullying, doxing, and internet trolling might all be said to constitute the networked iteration of scatologia, or what might be called cyber scatologia. Attack paraphilias are inherently selfish, violent, dangerous, and typically criminal indulgences in fantasy enactment that require victimizing others, including acquiring non-consenting partners, or both passive and active violence in order to complete. The term is used interchangeably with criminal paraphilia, and this is a paraphilia, the idea that of having sex on a railroad track. When a train is coming, and that's the danger. This is really kind of a bizarre picture, but it is actually a paraphilia that they have seen in Europe, not so much in the United States, but in Europe, of course, trains are very common. It's a very common way of traveling. United States, not so much. Most of our trains are freight trains. No, they're not passenger trains. But in Europe, of course, they have a lot more passenger trains. Teens and young adults whose sexuality is shaped in the echo chamber of social media world, a contiguous set of deviant cyber communities, where what is known as relational paraphilic attachment or relationships and ideas developed through fantasy and acted out in paraphilic behaviors may in many cases be unaware of the potentially dangerous nature of their ideas. They just think it's something that they find sexually enticing, but they could be very dangerous indeed. The self-perceived need to act on these impulses is not always a conscious decision. It is a compulsion that dates to an offender's formative years when his or her personality and sexual self-image was first imprinted. Because secondary attack paraphilias involve non-consenting partners, there is a natural elevated risk to strangers who otherwise actually account for a smaller number of victims in violent crime than family members or acquaintances. In other words, they're more likely to fixate on somebody that they know than somebody that is a stranger. It is widely known that paraphilias don't progress and regress in a linear fashion. In other words, because a paraphilic moves into more directly victimizing behavior and dangerous acts of relational paraphilic attachment, does not mean that they will continuously escalate or even stay at that secondary level. As seen among countless violent offenders, paraphiliacs are able to accelerate and decelerate their relational paraphilic attachment behaviors based on a variety of circumstances. These include life stage identity, access to money and resources, work and obligatory non-work commitments, and sexual virility. Their progression and expansion to include new relational paraphilic attachment behaviors is modular and not linear in this design. preparatory and attack paraphilias over time and even at the same time, thus operate along a circuit rather than as a set of rigidly defined intervals. The core four paraphilias, sadism, mutilophilia, necrophilia, and pedophilia, represent the most recurring deviant drives in both clinical and forensic populations, but also exist within a spectrum of greatly varying behaviors, fantasies, and associated crimes, including social media activities and online misconduct. And one of the things that you need to understand is that these fetishes, these paraphilias, all develop in their formative years. It's when they're 10, 11, 12 years old. It's just before puberty. It's their focus on what is supposed to be sexuality. Everybody has a sexuality. Everyone has this desire for human contact. So the question is, where did this come from? What were they doing at this time during their formative years? Were they watching strange videos on YouTube? What was it that gave them their ideas? And because there are, we can control what's on television. We can control what magazines are in the house. But can we control what children are watching on these videos? What kind of videos are they watching? What are they? Is it videos that develop normal romantic ideas, or is it some strange idea about something else? Let me give you a quick example before we move to the next slide. Let me give you a quick example. Back in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, young men in England were sent to private schools, and they were sent to private schools from a fairly young age. Well, a lot of these individuals got into trouble when they're at these private schools. And the punishment was caning or was paddling, was spanking them. So in the 1960s, a lot of strange things were happening. It was right after World War II. A lot of individuals were trying to decide: the Russians were good people during World War II, and then all of a sudden they became bad people. They were trying to decide: should I help the Russians? Should I not help the Russians? So the Russians sent over a lot of females to entrap these males. And one of the things that they did, one of the fetishes, one of the paraphilias that the Russians used was spanking. And one of the things that these men wanted the women to do was to dominate them and spank them, or the men wanted to spank the women. I guess that's all. Okay, that's what I was thinking of. Anyway, they wanted the women to dominate them. Where in the world did all this come from? Why were there so many English diplomats who had this as a fetish, as a paraphilia? And the answer was that this is during their formative years. The paddling was part of, it was the punishment. It was not only the punishment of the institution, but it was also the punishment of whatever club they were in. If they did something wrong, of course, they had to be punished. And how was that done? It was paddling. Now, they do the same thing in American fraternities, but of course, by the time they're being paddled, they've already developed whatever fetish that they were going to develop. But all these men that were fairly wealthy and fairly well-to-do, from very, very good families, they were all sent to private school, and these private schools, that's the way they punished them. And this became an Arado Mania. This became an eroticism for these men, and that's how the Russians got into the English aristocracy. They were able to break into these individuals and get them to give them to give them secrets of of ours, of the United States, because the English had, our nuclear secrets, just like we gave them all this information, and then they gave it to the Russians. And how did that happen? Well, there were several different scandals that took place, especially in the 1960s, the Perfumo Scandal and whatnot. So that's just an example of what can happen. Uh, and of course, in the United States, we're going, I don't understand this. Why? Why is this something that anybody cares about? And as it turned out, it had to do with with the fact that these guys had gone to private schools where paddling became an erotic thing. Anyway, okay, so we're talking about forensic applications. Pedophilia is classified as a sexual interest in children or prepubescent youths of either gender. This paraphilia can manifest itself in a wide array of preparatory and attack behaviors that range from the viewership and trafficking of prohibited explicit images to infiltrating chat rooms in order to lure underage victims to offline meeting sites. Just yesterday, they rescued a North Carolina 14-year-old who had been taken off the street. 14-year-old female. She was being driven across the country. They found her in a car in Kentucky. She gave the symbol for I need help. Uh, I need help. I I could show it to you. But she showed them the symbol, and the police were able to rescue her. But it happened just this week. 14-year-old was taken off the streets of North Carolina. On the extreme end, it can involve forcing child relatives into the production of pornography, the molestation of children, relatives, or wards, and even the abduction and sexual murder of children unknown to the offender. Preparatory adjuncts, blastolagnia is an erotic and predatory interest in early female teens for the purposes of sexual initiation. Somnophilia is an erotic interest in people, usually females, who are asleep or unconscious and otherwise vulnerable. And these are the preparatory adjuncts of pedophilia. Attack adjuncts, scopophilia, an erotic interest in spying on, recording, or otherwise watching people, usually strangers in private or intimate settings, without their knowledge, for example, peeping toms. Voyeurism is an erotic interest in making physical contact with strangers in public under false pretenses but for inherently sexual purposes, such as by rubbing against people in crowds, for example, subway gropers. And of course, he's turned the wrong way, but this guy's turned the other way. Is he going to be a groper, or is he not? On the afternoon of May 12, 2003, a 35-year-old software developer named Michael Bure was living in the West End of downtown Toronto, Canada. Bure at the time had no criminal record or police involvement, but was an inveterate pedophile and viewer of underage pornography. Following a day of compulsively viewing and sharing images of children through peer-to-peer or P2P file sharing, a common file exchange and social networking method at the time, Bure observed 10-year-old Holly Jones walking by her home, where nearby he rented a small apartment. No longer able to contain his libidinous urges for children, violent fantasies involving sex with a child having been intensified through hours of watching and discussing lewd material with other pedophiles, Bure made the decision to kidnap Jones. Following a series of violent sexual assaults, Bure manually strangled the girl and he dismembered her, and then he disposed of the body in a lake. Following a remarkably detailed and committed police investigation that was able to link Bure to the random crime, he was arrested for the murder of Jones in June of 2003, and he quickly pled guilty. Bourret indicated that despite being historically nonviolent, his passive viewing ultimately eroded his ability to control his actions. He was found out because he had fibers from his rug were found on the young lady's body, and that's how they uh, connected him to her. Anyway, it's quickly accelerated. Necrophilia is classified as a sexual interest in dead bodies in various levels of decomposition and of funerary goods and services more generally. This paraphilia also has a wide spectrum of associated behaviors that range from the strange and morbid, but otherwise harmless, to the extraordinarily dangerous. I'm not going to show you any pictures of dead bodies, so don't worry. This is not really. This is from a movie. Female necrophiles tend to conform to a subgroup known as romantic necrophiles, who simply prefer the company of the dead and fantasize about relationships with them when they are alive, a category thought to represent as many as 1/3 of mortuary employees. On the other hand, the true necrophile may indulge in grave robbing or the viewing of necrophilic pornography, while the homicidal necrophile is prepared to murder an innocent stranger to acquire a dead body of his or her own. I once upon a time was living in Montana, and there was this young man that ran over. He was in his pickup truck, 16-year-old boy. He's on his way to school. He saw this lady jogging, and he hit her with his truck and knocked her down. He thought she was dead. He loaded her into the back of his pickup truck, and then he turned around and started to go home. Well, she woke up. She wasn't dead. She woke up while she was in the truck, and when he stopped at a stoplight, she crawled out of the back of the truck. And they caught him. And when they caught him, they asked him what he thought he was doing, and why he hit the lady. And he said that he wanted to have sex with her dead body, and he was going to keep her until she started to decompose. Of course, he was only 16, but they tried him as an adult. Well, anyway, it was an ugly, ugly situation. This was in Great Falls, Montana. As weird as that is. So necrophiles do exist. Preparatory adjuncts, taphophilia, an erotic interest in cemeteries, tombstones, crypts, funeral proceedings, and other grave artifacts or emblems of mourning. If you've ever watched NCIS, Abby Shuto used to be on the show. She was on the show once upon a time, and she seemed to have taphophilic tendencies. She liked cemeteries. She slept in a coffin and whatnot. Galadism is an erotic interest in mannequins, dolls, statues, and other lifeless human surrogates. Galadism. Attack adjuncts, partialism, and erotic interest in specific and discrete and atypical body parts, usually on their own and not necessarily attached to a living body. That's partialism. So it would be hands or arms or legs or whatever. Vampirism is an erotic interest in blood, usually for the purposes of drinking, touching, or otherwise acquiring and consuming, often with other cannibalistic activities. Two actors that seem to have had this whole vampire thing going was Billy Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie. They were married once upon a time, and they used to carry vials of each other's blood around their necks. What that had to do with, nobody's quite sure. I'm sure some people know what it had to do with, but anyway, vampirism. One time, New York Police Department patrol officer Gilberto Valle, with an otherwise successful marriage and budding law enforcement career, had a dark secret to hide when he began immersing himself in necrophilia chat rooms and compulsively viewing corpse pornography sometime around 2010. Valle was able to keep his preparatory behaviors under wraps, in part due to the secretive nature of his activities and their being relegated to social media. Once Vallet's pregnant wife became suspicious and examined his browser history, she discovered conversations with other necrophiles, the plotting of her own murder, as well as the kidnapping, murder, and sexual dismemberment, partialism, and cannibalization, vampirism, of over 100 other targeted women. This is his wife. Oh, there she is, right there. Oh, I'm sorry. There she is, right there. Upon being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and other crimes, it was determined that Vallet was also stalking a teenage neighbor, Blastolagnia, and spying on other women, in part through the misuse of his access to a police database that contained personal and financial data, Scopophilia. Initially convicted of conspiracy, Vallet's conviction was overturned when it was ruled that fantasizing, planning, and even committing associated gateway crimes were not deterministic of a willingness and ability to eventually carry out murder. This is Vallet with his mother. She supported him through the whole thing. Mutilophilia is classified as a sexual interest in gore, viscera, and carnage. This paraphilia tends to inevitably take on a criminal dimension as the paraphiliac becomes increasingly curious and visually stimulated by progressively elaborate methods of dissection, mutilation, or dismemberment of still alive things, whether human or animal, and whether still alive or already dead. And this, of course, is for medical purposes, for teaching purposes. This is not real. That's plastic. Don't get excited. Preparatory adjuncts: paraphilia, an erotic interest in fire, starting in destruction wrought by fire. Zoosadism, an erotic interest in flaying, dissecting, or experimentally mutilating small animals, including domesticated pets, and usually while still alive. Attack adjuncts: picarism, an erotic interest in stabbing, puncturing, and otherwise violently penetrating a living body as a surrogate sex act. Stabbings with an excess of 12 insertion points are now generally understood as being sexually motivated or indicative of an offender with picarist tendencies. Arado is an erotic interest in eviscerating, dismembering, or severely mutilating human victims. It is the one paraphilia most consistently associated with what is known as lust murders, the lust being the bloodlust and the disordered, sexually predicated on extreme gore. And of course, that has to do with the Jack the Ripper murders at the turn of the 20th century. Beginning in 2010 with fantasies cultivated through the composition of short stories and online exchanges in BDSM chat rooms regarding acts of picarism, the use of a blade to simulate sexual penetration, Graham Dwyer eventually became weary of viewing images and discussing his fantasies. Eventually, he could only become sexually aroused with both his wife and the various paramours he met online through social media if there was actually a knife present in the room as visual stimulation. Later, his obsession escalated to the point that he needed to use retractable plastic stage knives to simulate stabbing his sexual partners to death in order to maintain sexual performance. A depressed, despondent, and convenient victim seeking belonging in the BDSM online community named Elaine O'Hara was lured to a remote site by Dwyer. Using a real knife to stab O'Hara to satiate a disordered and violent sexual obsession first cultivated in social media, Dwyer stabbed O'Hara to death and disposed of her body in a marsh. Following his conviction for O'Hara's murder, the British press estimates that Dwyer receives 2 letters a week from deranged female pen pals and 50 Shades aficionados who sympathize with his methods and his motives. He is from Ireland. Sadism, classified as a sexual interest in the physical and emotional suffering, humiliation, and traumatizing of others. It is often trivialized or otherwise misattributed as a component of consensual sexual bondage and other BDSM rituals, when in reality, at its extreme, it is the most dangerous of all the paraphilias and strongly correlated with serial rapists and serial sexual murderers. Preparatory adjuncts, coprographia, an erotic interest in tormenting people through the use of written communications, usually vulgar, threatening, or insulting in nature, and often in the aftermath of a collateral crime in order to prolong the victimization process. Scatologia, an erotic interest in making obscene or threatening telephone calls and eliciting shock, fear, or disgust. The two preparatory paraphilias often include illegal acts, such as indecent exposure and making harassing calls, and often exist concurrently. Coprographia and scatologia. Adjunct attacks, amacocycia, an erotic interest in disfiguring the faces of people, usually female strangers, and sometimes known as Jack the Ripper syndrome. Agonophilia is an erotic interest in watching people fight, struggle, suffer, or be overcome with fear or despair. In 2012, a 15-year-old Canadian girl named Amanda Todd published a short film to YouTube titled My Story. Using a series of cue cards, Todd shared her trauma of being cyberbullied and having become suicidal, eventually taking her own life a month later in what became a tragedy that finally drew international attention to the problem of cyberbullying. In 2014, Todd's tormentor, who had driven her to suicide, was identified as a Dutchman named Aiden Coben, a prolific pedophile and sadist who enjoyed tormenting both men and women around the world. Todd, it turned out, was one of 39 victims in 4 countries who Coben had been harassing and sexually blackmailing for years, coercing underage females to send him naked images while also trafficking in child pornography. Coben's case confirms a paraphilic and sadistic dimension to cyberbullying, that cyberbullying and related behaviors, flaming, doxing, and trolling, represent digitally interfaced versions of coprographia, scatologia, as well as scapophilia and agonophilia. Cyberbullies are high-risk sexual deviants who typically engage in these behaviors to complement or otherwise enable more dangerous future offending. In Coben's case, both sadism and pedophilia. In 2015, Coben was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison by a court in the Netherlands. And this is the way he dressed up. That's the V for Vengeance mask. Vendetta. V for Vendetta, that's what it is. That he wore while he was talking to his victims. Does the population of paraphiliacs in social media spaces remain consistent or linear over time and relative to the overall population, or does it increase exponentially relative to the total number of users? Does increasing the total number of users increase the number of online paraphiliacs, or is there a saturation point? Is it possible that social media spaces as clinical populations as defined might actually induce and otherwise propagate new manifestations of identified paraphilias that have not really been identified yet? In social entropy, all systems enter a period of decline. The dissolving of boundaries of individual distinctions in a population group leads not to equilibrium, but only to social decay and disorder as new forms of asserting power reveal themselves. Even when systems are in check and every apparent inequality has been remedied, inevitable human factors, ego, sex drive, jealousy, selfishness, will eventually overpower that same system's redeeming qualities. The purportedly utopian architecture of social media aside, the breaking down of perceived barriers and bringing people together has done little but expedite timely access by offenders to an increasingly variable and vulnerable set of consolidated victims. Victimology can be defined as the study of the relationship between victims and offenders, victims and other victims, and victims of the criminal justice system and its various apparatuses. Category 1 are the young, Category 2 are females, Category 3 are the old, Category 4 are the cognitively disadvantaged, Category 5 are immigrants, Category 6 is minorities, Category 7 are those lacking street smarts, Category 8 is the depressed, Category 9 are the acquisitive. The victim's own avarice might put the person at a dramatically increased risk of being victimized. Category 10, the wanton, the heedless, the immodest, the libidinous, who generally dismissive of social conventions, are at elevated risk of being brought into contact with the criminally predisposed. Category 11 is the lonesome and heartbroken. Victims prepared to relax their defense mechanisms and take certain risks in order to mitigate their loneliness. And of course, this is the case of Amanda, whatever her name was, a 15-year-old. Now, Category 12, the tormentors. Category 13, the blocked. Those who are dispossessed, who otherwise feel as though they are unable to seek the assistance of the police or victim services as a result of their own illegal and or immoral activity. And these are the victims. Victim-specific reasons. The victim suffers from existing mental health or emotional issues and is fearful of the stress caused by the reporting process. The victim will not be taken seriously. The victim is reluctant to draw attention to his or her own computing activities or online associates. They're afraid that somebody will see what they've been doing themselves. Offender-specific reasons. The offender is often to the victim, complicating the reporting dynamic. The offender has threatened the victim, or the victim is otherwise fearful of reprisal from the offender. The offender is a person of trust or authority, and or the victim has conflicted feelings for the offender. Context-specific reasons. The victim is distrustful of his or her parents, educators, or the police and court system. The victim has had a negative experience with or otherwise doubts the competence of the site administrator and any internal reporting system. The victim is engaged or feels they are engaged in conduct that will also implicate them in any investigation. Researchers found a correlation between notable signs of brain abnormalities and a higher total number of paraphilias. We're talking about sexual murderers here. The stronger the vulnerability was also related to childhood sexual and physical abuse experiences, which points to a specific biosocial interaction. Such aberrant behavior was also associated with chronic isolation and victimization in childhood, leading to feelings of inferiority and worthlessness later linked to paraphilic behaviors. This is a 15-year-old boy. This is his father. His father was a pedophile, and he was molested as a child. At 15 years old, he kidnapped and murdered this 10-year-old girl. I don't remember the names of any of these people, but I remember this story. He's the father. He's one of the molesters. He molested the boy, and the boy at 15 kidnapped and murdered a 10-year-old, sexually assaulted and murdered a 10-year-old girl. The child who, during this very sensitive exploratory question asking or role-playing stage, is subject to mockery, prevention, prohibition, or punishment will have the routes of reference between sex and consent, love and lust, intimacy and respect all corrupted and rerouted. As the child's love map becomes vandalized and healthy connections are damaged, the child becomes imprinted with ideas of the body and intimate situations that are abnormal. And this is another sexual murder case. The man on the left sexually kidnapped and murdered the young lady on the right. It all goes back to childhood, and the trauma associated with a vandalized love map will form bizarre sexual preferences that replace people with objects, healthy consenting and reciprocal situations with fantasies left to fester for years in isolation as the child later grows lacking the knowledge, experience, or self awareness to explore proper relationships. And they are the ones who become sexual murderers. And he murdered her. Because males are much more visual than females, they will fixate on specific objects that are either immediately available as substitutions for people or which can function as sustainable outlets for their curiosity. Sometimes this happens during the process of vandalizing the love map, such as when a specific visual stimulus or reference point becomes forever associated with a life-changing traumatic incident. This will in turn lead to the development any number of paraphilias as trauma, shame, memory, rage, and the sex drive all refuse to diverge over a person's lifetime. And of course, when we talk about love maps, what we're talking about is the normal development of how relationships are supposed to develop, who you're supposed to be, who that person is supposed to be, uh, what is supposed to be erotic as far as the individual is concerned. These are all love maps, and we all have love maps. We all have ideas of how sex is supposed to occur, how love is supposed to develop, how we are supposed to adhere ourselves to a select idea or erotic concept. And unfortunately for some people, of course, their love maps are skewed. They become fixated on things like the British aristocracy that became their love map had something to do with spanking, with beating, with domination. As weird as that may seem, this doesn't make sense to anybody who doesn't have these fetishes, that doesn't have this idea. It really doesn't make any sense, but it's real. I mean, they become fixated. They obsess over different things that are not supposed to be part of their love map, and that's how these paraphilias, that's how these fetishes develop. And of course, if that has to do with molesting a 12-year-old male or female, then that's what is on their map. That's what they develop. Uh, that's how they decided that that's what they had to do. This is a case in point. At 15, he was molested by his father at age 10. So what did he do with the young lady? He did exactly the same thing. But in his case, of course, he raped and murdered her. Something his father didn't do. His father just molested him. But somehow that had become maybe the rage of being molested by his father. That became a murderous rage. Anyway, all of these individuals have skewed love maps. Paraphilias seldom have only one fixation. This also explains why many sexually abused males go on to become abusers themselves, in that the trauma of being abused at once robs them of their childhood and of their ability to form a healthy understanding of intimacy. They're going on to revisit what they know and continuing the cycle of abuse. And there you go. That is the end of the chapter. Ugly chapter. I apologize for that. But possibly this can help you understand why some things happen. Um, there is no society that is pure. There's no society that is always, nothing bad ever happens. This happens in all societies. So there you go. We'll talk about the next chapter is about terrorism, which should be a lot of fun. And that's the last chapter in Arndtfield and Swart, and then we will get into gaming, and won't that be fun?